All right, now that we've learned about conditional statements, let's take a look at ways we can take a conditional statement and make new statements out of them. And the first thing we're going to look at is what's called a negation. And a negation, as you can read here, is the opposite of a statement. So if I say a statement like, let's make this statement, I love Bieber. The negation of that would be the direct opposite. Usually we say not P. If the statement is P, then the negation would be not P. And the symbol is this little squiggly symbol in front of the statement itself. So what would be the negation of I love Bieber? What's the direct opposite of that? I don't love Bieber. And you can argue whether hate is the opposite of love. Most people would not say that's the case, but I don't love Bieber is definitely the opposite of I love Bieber. So that's what we call a negation. Now let's use the conditional that I've got here. If I studied really hard, then I earned an A on the test. And let's take a look at that. First of all, can you identify the hypothesis? That would be that I studied really hard is our hypothesis. And our conclusion is I earned an A on the test. Got a typo there. Now, if we do that, let's just summarize that this way. Studied really hard would be the hypothesis, so let's call that S. And what's the implication? If I studied really hard, then I earned an A on the test. So let's say study implies A on the test. Now, the first conditional we can change that to is called the converse. And it's to do this, to take the conditional and switch around the hypothesis and the conclusion. So if you look in this example, look at what comes first as the hypothesis. I earned an A on the test. If I earned an A on the test, then I studied really hard is the conclusion. So it's been switched around. A implies S. An A on the test implies that I studied really hard. So it's just the reverse of the original. The next one we want to look at is called the inverse. And this is where we take our conditional statement and we leave everything in its spot, but we negate both the hypothesis and the conclusion. So we're going to take them and give them opposite meaning. Our original hypothesis was I studied really hard. So our negation, there you see it right there, I didn't study really hard. So we are saying that the studying did not happen. And then therefore the implication is the conclusion, I didn't earn an A on the test. So I did not study really hard, therefore I did not earn an A on the test. This is our inverse. If I didn't study really hard, then I didn't earn an A on the test. This is our inverse. And the last one's called the contrapositive, and this is where a lot of stuff happens. We're taking our original conditional and we are switching around the order and we're negating it. So we're doing both the converse and the inverse. Again, we're switching the order and negating, taking the opposite. So how does it read? If I didn't earn an A on the test, then I didn't study really hard. I didn't earn an A on the test would look like this, and therefore I didn't study really hard. I didn't study really hard is the negation of our original hypothesis. And that's our contrapositive. So in summary, if we want to fill out our table, we can say that the negation takes a statement and it changes it or gives its opposite meaning. There's the symbol for it. If our statement is P, then this would look like not P. Our original conditional is like we saw in our last lesson. P implies Q, where P is the hypothesis and Q is the conclusion. And then things start changing around. On a converse, we take P implies Q and we switch it around. Converse says Q implies P. On the inverse, we leave things where they are, but we do switch the meaning. We negate them. So I'm going to say not P implies not Q. Compare that back to this original. Everything's in the same spot, but it has been negated. And then finally, our contrapositive. Everything gets switched around here, everything. So our original was P implies Q. This one's going to be not Q. So I've changed the order and the meaning. Implies not P. Now compare that again to the original. Everything's switched around as well as been negated. So let's go to the next page. Let's take a look at some other examples and see if this makes a little more sense as we go through. Alrighty, let's go over some directions before we look at these examples. There's a lot of things they're asking us to do. First of all, if the given statement is not an if-then form, we're going to rewrite it. So we want to make sure we're in if-then form. Then we're going to identify the hypothesis and the conclusion. Then we're going to write what the converse, the inverse, and the contrapositive. Get that back. And we're going to determine the truth value. Is that true or false? Each statement that we make. Finally, if it's false, we're going to give a counterexample. All right, first one, our conditional statement. If you are a quarterback, then you play football. Now that one's already in the if-then form, but let's identify hypothesis and conclusion. So what comes after the if? In this case, you are a quarterback. This is our hypothesis. And the conclusion is you play football, introduced by the word then. So we've got hypothesis is you're a quarterback. Let's call that Q. And the conclusion, you play football. Let's call that F. Now, let's take that and write the converse. In the converse, we're switching things around. So we're going to want to write, if you play football, then you are a quarterback. So let's write that out. If you play football, then you are a quarterback. Okay, let's try the inverse now. On the inverse, we leave the original in its spots, but we change or negate them. And so we're going to want to say it this way. The original was, if you're a quarterback, you play football. Now it's going to say, if you are not a quarterback, then you do not play football. Okay, so in written form, if you are not a quarterback, then you don't play football. Alrighty, now the contrapositive. In the contrapositive, we do both things together. Original is going to get switched around, and we're going to negate them as well. So on our contrapositive, we want it to say this. If you don't play football, then you are not a quarterback. And let's write that out. Okay, let's go back now and let's do these other parts of the question where we're supposed to determine the truth value of each of these statements. So are these true or are they false? Our first statement, the original, if you're a quarterback, then you play football. Now, according to my understanding, football is the only game that has quarterbacks in it. And so if you're a quarterback, you automatically play football. That's going to be true. Now the next one, if you play football, then you're a quarterback. So all football players are automatically quarterbacks. Is that true? Obviously not. We've got halfbacks, we've got receivers, we've got linemen. So this is a false one. And I just listed a bunch of counterexamples. We're supposed to give a counterexample. Let's say receiver. Or any other position besides quarterback would work. All right, now our inverse. If you're not a quarterback, then you don't play football. So anybody qualified as not a quarterback, but you do play football? Of course. So again, we've got the same kind of counterexamples we just listed. Any other position would work. So we can use receiver again here. And I'm spelling this wrong. It's receiver. Somebody should correct me in class tomorrow. First one that comes and tells me I spelled receiver wrong, I'll give you a piece of candy. Okay. Contrapositive, we said if you don't play football, then you're not a quarterback. So all of you people out there that don't play football and fit that category, can we say that you're not a quarterback? We definitely can. If you're not a football player, there's no way you're going to be a quarterback. So this one is true. Back to inverse, we didn't write it down. That's false. All right, so that's how that works. Let's give another one a shot. We'll do the drummers or musicians, and then the other ones are up to you, and we'll give you a shot to try them on your own. So now the first thing I notice on this one is that it's not already in if-then form. So I need to identify the hypothesis and the conclusion, and I need to write this in if-then form. Drummers are musicians. So if you are a what, then you are automatically a what. And on this one, I'm going to say that if you're a drummer, then you're a musician is the way this is reading. So that's going to be my if-then form. If you are a drummer, then you are a musician. And we're going to rewrite that. Drummer implies that you're a musician. So we want to write it out in a complete sentence. Okay, let's get ready to switch some things around now. So the converse, again, we're going to switch the hypothesis and the conclusion around. We're going to put the M implies the D. So to write that out, we want to say that if you are a musician, then you are a drummer. Alrighty, for inverse. Inverse, go back to your original and negate. Negate both parts of that. What's the opposite of if you are a drummer? Of course, that's if you are not a drummer. So we're going to make this say if you are not a drummer, then that implies that you are not a musician. If you're not a drummer, then you're not a musician. Alrighty, last one is the contrapositive. Everything gets switched around. This one's got the most involved stuff. Okay, again, you always want to go back to your original. So if we had D implies M, and on a contrapositive we're going to switch everything. We're going to change the order, and we're going to negate it. Then this is going to say this. Not a musician implies that you are not a drummer. If you're not a musician, then you're not a drummer. Okay, so did we do it? We've written the converse, the inverse, and the contrapositive. Let's go back and talk about the truth values. True or false from the original. Drummers are musicians. Now, I know a few kids that are going to really argue with you on this one. If they're drummers, they're going to get mad at you if you say that's false. That is definitely true. I've seen some amazing drummers. In fact, drumming is one of my favorite of all the musical instruments. So, drummers are musicians. This is true. They're great musicians. Converse. If you're a musician, then you're a drummer. Well, we can't say that's true because I've met plenty of violinists and trombone players and singers. They're musicians, but they don't necessarily play the drums. So this is going to be false. And we want to give a counterexample. Let's say you play the harp. Harpists are musicians, but not drummers. How about the inverse? If you're not a drummer, then you are not a musician. In other words, people who don't drum, then they're not classified as musicians. Again, that's definitely false. You can think of a lot of other instruments someone might play. So we can use harpist again for our counterexample. And our final one. If you're not a musician, if you're not a musician, then you are not a drummer. So I'm not a musician. I can sing a little bit, but let's say play an instrument. I'm not a musician, so I'm not a drummer. That's pretty much automatic. So this is a true. Not a musician means I'm not going to be a drummer for sure. Now I want you to notice something here on these. Notice that on our conditional statement, both of these actually started out as true. But just because our conditional statement is true, does that mean all the rest of them are true? Obviously not. When we change the things around, when we change either the order or we change and negate the parts, then we're also changing the meaning of it, and they may or may not be true again. So just because the conditional is true doesn't mean the converse is true, although it could be. Be careful. In these examples, we saw two where they were false, but it is possible for both of those to be true. And something else that I wanted to point out that you really want to pay attention to, when you write a conditional statement and you compare it to the contrapositive, those are actually what we call logically equivalent. So the conditional here and the contrapositive over here, these actually have the same truth value every time. If my conditional statement is true, then it's automatic that my contrapositive is going to be true also. Again, that's called logically equivalent. They're true or they're false together. And the same thing could be said of the converse and the inverse. These two right here, these are also logically equivalent. Meaning if one of them is true, the other one's automatically going to be true. If one's false, the other will be false. So they have the same answers on the true-false questions. And in that case, they also would have the same counterexample. Notice that I used the same counterexample on my converse and my inverse when I was saying they were false, because they are meaning the same thing. So that's actually something that might help you as you go through your assignments and your questions. Now, these last ones are for you to try. So you're going to do the same stuff. You got a lot to write in there, I know. Maybe you need to give your fingers a little exercise before you start to make sure the blood is flowing. And good luck to you.